Thank you. Let me first thank Kim and Achilles and everybody else who's been organizing the Athens Democracy Forum. It's an honor to be here speaking and talking with all of you. This video we just saw was almost a perfect setup for what we want to talk about on this panel. I thought Leila and Hanan put their fingers on exactly the topics we want to cover in this. Most of what we've been talking about over the last 3 days has been about democracy in a national context, and those are obviously really important conversations. But many of the problems facing the world today go beyond the borders of the nation state, and what we want to do on this panel is talk about this category of the planetary and planetary challenges, and how do we think about that in the context of democracy. So before we get into all those details, I thought I would start by asking Stewart, when we talk about planetary thinking, what do we mean by that? Where did that idea come from? And why is this suddenly becoming a thing we want to talk about now?
Thanks, Nils. Well, the concept of the planetary has really come to center stage because we have a collision between the system we have in world politics, as the preceding speakers on the video described, in which the world is divided up 193 sovereign nation states, but the problems of the Earth system obey no boundaries. So we have a collision between those two very different world orders. And we see this most dramatically in climate change, of course, but we also see it in collapsing biodiversity around the world, in the global pollution crisis, and in increasing evidence that the multilateral system and the sovereign state system have been unable to deal with these. We saw it actually in fall 2024 alone. We saw it in Cali, Colombia at the Conference on Biological Diversity. We saw it a little bit later at the COP in Azerbaijan, and then we saw it in the failure of the Global Plastics Treaty in Busan, South Korea. So we have this collision between these two worlds, and it's obvious that the nation state is both, in a sense, too small to deal with these problems, but unlike cities and municipalities, in a sense, too removed from the people to actually help meet their needs and to work with them in addressing them. So we need a paradigm shift. We need a paradigm shift away from the international or even the global to the planetary to think about this. Now, even back in 1970, George Kennan, who was the founder of the containment doctrine of the Soviet Union, often seen as one of the world's biggest political realists, he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs saying, we need to have a supranational entity to deal with the problems of the world's environment. This is back in 1970. A lot of that one Earth, one planet thinking went by the wayside, partly with the rise of neoliberalism and globalization. But it's sprung up to the fore now because humanity is now in a situation where we are exceeding the planet's the boundaries that define a safe and just operating space for humanity. And so there have been, and we're approaching different tipping points, from the Amazon rainforest to the melting of ice shelves in Antarctica. So we need to change things, and some people have said, well, we need to get up to the planetary. Now, creating planetary institutions, though, as we're going to find out, creates a lot of different questions about how that relates to national sovereignty after we think about it, and how it relates to the global economy as it's currently organized, and of course, how it relates to democracy.
Building on what Stewart just said, President Turk, climate change, biodiversity loss, other planetary challenges of the sort that we just were discussing, they don't respect borders, as Stewart just said. So how can planetary governance help us move beyond the limitations of the kind of state-centric system that we have inherited?
Well, a short answer is very difficult and highly unlikely. That's the short answer. And I'm saying this based on an experience I had decades ago, that was after the ending of the Cold War, where the international atmosphere was very favorable to a search for new models of global cooperation. The awareness of planetary environmental issues was already quite high, and goodwill was there. There was very little political poisoning around, so that was an optimistic moment. At that time, the United Nations Security Council met at the level of heads of state and asked the Secretary General, Boutros Ghali, at that time, to write an agenda for peace, which he did. an optimistic analysis with a number of very good proposals, which were immediately blocked in the General Assembly discussion the next year, 1993-94. And then, of course, there were additional documents of this kind, an agenda for development, an agenda for democracy, but everything was blocked. Now, what does this tell us? This is a good illustration of the fact that the international mechanisms which we currently have are really very limited. They are based on the idea, as you said, on sovereignty. United Nations itself is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all member states. That's the framework. And so far, it has not been possible to go beyond that framework. Now, what is to be done? A famous question once asked by Lenin. I'm not suggesting a global revolution, obviously. But the fact is that the accumulation of problems is something that forces a lot of new thinking. And of course, I'm very interested to hear from our fellow panelists what they have to say about that. But I think that the environmental crisis, the problem, which one aspect is becoming quite pronounced but not yet fully understood, will force the world to find new solutions. I'm thinking about the problems or the crisis of the global water cycle. You know, water is global, and the water cycle is deeply stressed right now, creating all kinds of water disasters. And all of them are seen in isolation. Each is dealt with separately, and there is no common approach, let alone a common platform for that. And I believe that problems like this are going to grow, they are going to accumulate, and they are going to force nation states to come to a better arrangement for the future. When that will happen is hard to say. But the experience of 1990s tell us that we have to be really very careful in this, because that was an optimistic moment when it was felt that, you know, everything can change, everything will change for the better. Agenda for peace, development, there were these big conferences of the United Nations on various development issues. And now, 30 years later, we see all that was insufficient. So we need something more, maybe something that would result from the kind of things like the crisis of global water cycle and will be expressed through global cyberspace, creating a sufficient pressure. That's in general.
So, Hélène, building on what President Turk just said, it's obvious that the institutions aren't working, but there's actually a structural reason for that, really. Like the legacy institutions that we've inherited, the UN system, the multilateral system, the national states, why can't they get this done at present in the current institutional arrangement?
Because they were built, you know, as already said, on the principle of the nation states, so the morally and politically relevant units are not the right one. I think at that level, at the global scale, the morally and politically relevant units are human beings, people who suffer from droughts, from lack of access to water, etc. And so we should have a representation at the global scale that follows the principle of one person, one vote, or one person, one lottery ticket, as in the Citizens' Assembly model. And how do we get to that sort of alternative model? I think we need a global GovZero moment. So GovZero, if you're not familiar, it's a concept invented by a group of activists in Taiwan, circa 2014, when during the Sunflower Revolution, they sort of occupied the parliament and said, we are offering, you know, alternative tools. They call it forking the government. You're creating alternative websites that deliver information better. You're creating alternative institutions that, you know, deliver good governance better. And what they managed to do, so it was a sort of revolution, but a very peaceful one, they managed to convince the legacy institutions to recognize their failures and to co-opt the offered alternatives. So Audrey Tang, who was kind of one of the leaders of that revolution, was a hacker. She became the first digital minister of digital affairs in Taiwan, where she governed for 8 years, helped the government deal with the COVID crisis, etc. So I think at the global level, we need to replicate that strategy of offering alternatives, for example, by building on Jim Fishkin's, you know, idea of a, global conversation online among randomly selected people, until we've done it enough and shown that it works to get the social movements behind those things, and maybe then the UN will wake up and say, hey, maybe we should create a permanent citizens' assembly of 1,000 randomly selected people, selected on the basis not of what nation they belong to, but where they live on the globe, like as member of planet Earth.
That's great. This is, as President Turk said, Mete, these are human problems. And you work in London. A lot of these things are going to be dealt with at local levels because the effects are happening locally to people in specific places. So tell us a little bit about how London is addressing kind of the challenges. We can talk about planetary challenges and planetary boundaries, but the manifestations are specific. So you're dealing with some specific things that are happening in London. How do you guys think about what the role of the City of London is relative to these larger planetary questions?
Yeah, look, I think there's a danger that we can overcomplicate these things. And, one of the reasons why I love being in city government level, at a local government level, is because we're just solely focused on delivering. If you look at what we've achieved in London since 2016, we've, had more than 2,300 electric buses across our city, the highest number for any major city in the Western world. We've cleaned our air. So when the mayor first got elected in 2016, experts told him it would take 193 years for us to clean London's air quality, and we've achieved it as of this week because of bold action, because we delivered the world's largest clean air zone. We created 900 hectares of green space, hundreds of schools benefiting from solar PV because of the action that we've taken. We've got a £1 billion green finance facility where we're helping support the decarbonisation of some of our landmark buildings across our city. We've reduced carbon emissions through using our planning permission powers by over 21%, way ahead of national government because of regulations we put forward through the London Plan and the planning permissions. The point I'm trying to make is I can go on and on and on. The point I'm trying to make is while nation governments delay, it's cities who are at the forefront of tackling the climate crisis and actually can lead by taking tangible actions. And I think ultimately, what we're also part of as London is we are part of the C40 Cities network. The Mayor of London is the co-chair of C40 Cities. And what we've been doing is organising over 100 cities right across the world to make sure that we're cooperating and working together, because we know that most people who will be living with the impacts of climate change in the future will be living in cities. And so if you take, for example, in 2017, there was only one city in the world who had a climate action plan that conformed with the Paris Agreement. Now, we've got over 90 cities that conform with that agreement. And the point I'm trying to make is even as we get to COP in a month's time, there's a real danger that, we all sit around and wait for what international agreements can happen, or actually we can actually just crack on with it at a local level and really deliver. We've diverted 2/3 of our funds from C40 cities to the global south, also recognizing the climate justice point too. And so I think, cities are already taking on these issues, and, we're cutting down emissions much faster than national governments. And so I don't think, there is a secret formula or a theoretical sort of research that's going to help us achieve that. I think what people expect of us and what my Londoners, what my residents expect of me is to make sure that we're cracking on with delivery and actually delivering on our promises to ultimately create a city that, people can afford to live, people can, breathe clean air, people can have energy bills that aren't affected by global crises. This is a massive social justice issue. So, I think we just got to crack on with delivering.
We'll get back to the social justice thing in a minute, but I want to turn back to you, Hélène, for a second, because I'm glad you mentioned the C40 network. I think one of the real stories of planetary thinking is thinking laterally at subnational levels. But it's also important that we have mechanisms of inclusion and scalability for these solutions. So London's doing all these wonderful things. How do we make sure that people feel like they're included in these practices? And there's a number of examples you can talk about, Maison Publique or the Global Assembly from 2021. Tell us about some of the ways in which solutions to planetary things are being potentially scaled up through these kinds of mechanisms.
Yeah, I would get a little uncomfortable when we focus so much on delivery, because it's always for the people, but you cannot have for the people unless it's by the people. So all for delivery, good governance, but never forget that you can't get that unless you include people. So example of things that have been done, I've tried to do that at the global level, are the Global Assembly organized by a group of activists now called ISWE, 100 people selected by their coordinates and population density from around the globe. So you had a Brazilian seamstress, Chinese farmer, an Afghanistan shepherd, like all talking together online about what kind of like principles for the world they would want to see. And what was fascinating, one of the recommendations actually was a crime of ecocide recognized globally. And it's the same idea that came out of the Climate Assembly in France in 2019-20 actually, but the French couldn't implement it because if only one country does it, then you sink your national companies, right? Like they get punished for murdering the environment and no one else does. But if you do it globally, if Exxon gets punished wherever it goes, if any company gets punished, then it's workable. Another example are itinerant assemblies, citizens' assemblies organized by Felipe Rey in Colombia. So trying to move them actually around so you get more inclusion. It's not just one, the capital or something like that. The Democratic Odyssey project that was done here in Athens all the way to Vienna via Florence by Calypso Nicolaidis. I mean, there are many, many examples of innovative ways to include people and sort of practice our democratic muscles. Because if you're just begging for good governance, politicians always promise that's what we get promised over and over again, but you will only get it when they listen and they include the voice of citizens.
This point of inclusion, I want to turn to you, President Turk, again on this, because just connecting these 2 points, last points we heard, it's really important for ethical reasons to make sure that we have an inclusive process and that we also make sure that the solutions are attentive to existing inequalities and don't reinforce those. So how do you think about how we build institutions and we think about planetary things in a way that ensures fairness within a city like London, but also fairness and inclusion across the globe?
Well, look, inclusion, the idea of inclusion is really a tall order. We must not think that this is something that can be easily or without any major change constructed in a short term. Inclusion is really very demanding. And obviously, while civil society movements at certain stages of development or certain stages of political process become more powerful and ensure that there is a high level of inclusion, that is not something that lasts forever or something that has a linear path of development. So I would be very careful with the conclusion that inclusion is something that can be worked out, easily or in a short period of time. Looking, at the world from a planetary perspective, one has to understand the primary focus of politicians, political class, are crises, are, issues that affect international peace and security very directly and today. Now, inclusion, is there, but it is not the first order of priority. If one thinks today about Palestine, the Middle East, for example, that takes an enormous amount of political energy everywhere and pushes many of the things that have to be a priority concern into a background. And the similar thing is with European security, with Ukraine, with all complications that result from that. So at the political level, we have a number of needs which have to be addressed by political means and that push away or push on the background more fundamental concerns. And of course, inclusion is the way forward, but it is very hard to achieve in this sort of circumstances. Unfortunately, there is no shortcut here. There has to be a solution, or there has to be some sort of management of global political problems if one wants to ensure a higher level of inclusion to deal with the global threats to existence of humankind. So that's really a very disturbing, very, tragic situation, which may end up in a series of further disasters, catastrophes, and we cannot exclude that. We have to be realistic in accepting that option. Now, do we have institutions which would have to deal with, which would have to worry about this, deal with this? I'm not sure. United Nations is marginalized as it hasn't been for a very long time now. We can say, we have heard yesterday about international trade in another panel, that in fact, while the World Trade Organization is blocked and the dispute settlement system of World Trade Organization is not functioning, but beneath that, there is a lot of development which shows interdependence and the need, existential needs of all actors, including all states, to preserve the level of trade cooperation and to develop it further. So, to answer your question directly, probably the way towards an answer is to look at what lies beneath. What lies beneath, because we are going to have to address primarily and deal with the issues of peace and security and crisis and all that. But what lies beneath? Are the societies changing in ways which would make inclusion easier, which would make the use of cyberspace more, how should I say, more effective and more complete? What lies beneath? I mean, that's where I believe one has to look for real answers.
Well, Mete, maybe one answer to what lies beneath is you have to figure out how to do these things. I mean, we all want to have an inclusion at a global planetary level, but inclusion has to begin and fairness has to begin in local considerations. You already mentioned this with respect to London. Do you want to talk about some of the ways in which specifically you do things in London to make sure that voices are included, perspectives are included, and that there's a push for fairness and justice in the way in which these policies you're pushing out get deployed?
Yeah, look, I mean, I reflect on my own journey into politics. I got involved in politics very young. I was 21 when I first got elected as a city councillor and then became deputy mayor at the age of 32. Partly the reason why I got involved in politics very young is because, you know, I make no secret, I'm not a traditional environmentalist. You know, I come into this from a perspective of being from the most deprived neighbourhood in the whole of the UK, which was disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate change, but we didn't know it. The fact that you go home and you see your parents opening up their energy bills year on year end and seeing an increase in their energy prices because we're dependent on fossil fuels, and every time someone's paying the price for it, it's working class Londoners. Or the fact that we've disconnected people from nature. We know this is a massive social, racial, and economic justice issue. So, you know, for me, absolutely agree with the points is, yes, we've got to focus on delivery, but of course, you know, partly the reason why I got involved in politics, and I know what Londoners expect, is that you've got to bring people together with you on that journey. So there's a number of things that we're doing in London to make sure we're doing that. And look, I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all approach. I don't think you're ever going to get a room like this full of like 200-300 people and fix every single issue or it's going to work. What you've got to do is you've got to normalize deliberative engagement into every single policy that you're actually putting forward at a local level. And you know, one of the things that we've done recently in London, we organised the first ever youth summit in London for Climate Youth Summit specifically on nature, which is how do we make sure that young people have more access to green spaces because we know this is a massive social justice issue. That then set the framework for a new climate action plan that will be set out in London in the very near future. So I think there's a number of things that you can do at a more strategic level to involve, you know, citizens in how they shape the strategy and the delivery mechanism you're going to do. But also, you know, we had a citizens jury on extreme heat, and that then led to a cool spaces map. It led to 44,000 water refill points. It led to 150 water fountains. It led to much more street trees being planted to help create shade along our streets as well. So I think, you know, that's the sort of the model is how do you make sure that on specific policy you involve citizens? Because the worst thing you could do, and the final point that I'll just make is that if you approach people to make sure that, you know, let me hear what you've got to say, and you can't deliver tangible action on the back of it, trust me, you'll put them off politics more in the long term. So I think, you know, what you need to do is make sure that when we do engage citizens, that you've got the budget, you've got the framework, and you've got the institutional buy-in to make sure that you can actually deliver while you're bringing people together. Otherwise, what you end up is in a talk shop, and that's what ultimately leads to this big distrust between people and politics.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Don't ask people what they want you to do if you're not prepared to actually help them accomplish those things. So these examples you gave are all really great, and they're all about adaptation. But a lot of the planetary challenges are things we have to mitigate. And so, Stewart, let me turn to you about that. these things are really important. These local, city and the city networks we're talking about to like get best practices out there. But are they enough? Do we need a different kind of set of institutions that can actually take on the things that transcend even the translocal?
Yeah, absolutely. We pointed to a bunch of challenges, and let me just run through a few things that we can do, both at an international level, but also in how we communicate with folks at a more local level in terms of trying to grapple with some of these issues with respect to the planetary. One of them is we need to reframe the whole concept of sovereignty so that we actually, rather than having this be a frontal assault on sovereignty, we basically say, let's reframe the obligations of sovereignty. Shouldn't some of the obligations of sovereignty be that sovereignty is not a blank check to despoil the environment? Shouldn't there be certain basic responsibilities of making sure that what you are doing within your territorial boundaries are not actually having negative spillover effects on other countries? And we've seen this in other aspects of sovereignty is not static. It changes, and its obligations change over time. So at a reframing level, that's really important. Another thing is that we need to learn, great powers in particular need to learn how to compartmentalize their rivalry. We live in two worlds right now. We live in a geopolitical world, and we also live in this world that some people call the Anthropocene, where we have all these environmental crises. China and the United States in particular need to be able to cooperate on climate change issues while also pursuing strategic rivalry elsewhere. The third point, which is related to that, is obviously there's don't wait for the United States in particular to try to lead on this issue in this particular administration. This administration is a war on climate science, a war on provision of global public goods, a war on even the sustainable development goals, but that doesn't mean the rest of the world can't move forward. It can form, in a post-American world, there are still plenty of countries that want to move forward together, and they can form high-ambition coalitions. And it's not just governments. As we pointed out, the C40 coalition, there are municipalities all around the world that are taking the lead on climate change and climate resilience. And the private sector has a huge role to play here, too. Companies don't want to assume climate risk. They want to mitigate against climate risk. They want to insure against it. Same thing with companies that are exposed to ecosystem risk around the world. So the good news is there is a coalition of the willing in the broadest sense that is still willing to move forward, and we cannot allow a country, my own country, the United States, which is ostrich-like with its head in the sand and is denying climate realities, to stop move forward movement. Just a couple other things. One of them, just picking up on Mete's great point about linking climate change to the practicalities of everyday life for citizens. What we've seen in this case is that too often climate concerns seem kind of remote to citizens. You remember when, during the Gilets jaunes or yellow vest protests in France, when Emmanuel Macron wanted to put on taxes on fuel. The protesters said, Macron cares about the end of the world. We care about the end of the month, as in paying rent. What we need to do is to connect climate change to people's electricity bills, to their are they going to get fresh water? Are farmers going to be able to have farms anymore? So we need to take those two time horizons and remind people that the end of the world might be a little closer to the end of the month than they think. And then the final thing that I'll say is a lot of it, again, these are long-term solutions, but we need to adapt the global economy to the realities of this current climate crisis and biodiversity crisis. For so long, we have treated nature as if it's something that we're not a part of. We haven't invested in natural capital. That is, what does the ecosystems provide people every day in terms of pollination of their crops or fresh water, et cetera. We need to start valuing and accounting for nature's ecosystem services and invest in natural capital in the same way we invest in human capital, in physical capital, financial capital. And again, this is a generational shift, but we got to get started and be much more proactive than we have been.
I want to just put in a plug for something on that note. One of the tools that's been used to help promote the Sustainable Development Goals over the last 30-odd years has been the Human Development Index. And the development of that index was a way of sort of measuring relative performance of different countries in terms of creating a more inclusive society, a society that would help enhance people's capabilities in their countries. There's a new index that's been proposed called the Nature Relationship Index. It's just been proposed by a consortium of scientists in I think it was Nature or Science magazine a couple of months ago. And I think that could become a tool for actually measuring our progress against some of these goals at a national level or even at a local level. I have one last question. I want to give you the last chance here, Hélène. So let's assume that one of the challenges we've been unfolding here is we have these legacy institutions that aren't really fit for purpose to dealing with a lot of these planetary scale challenges. Adaptation is taking place most successfully in places like London, with the kind of leadership that Mete is giving. Maybe new institutions and new coalitions of the capable and willing are going to emerge. What do you think the legacy institutions, whether it's the national state, in Beijing or Washington, or the supranational state in Brussels, or it's the United Nations system, how do you think, ideally, they would react to this ferment of innovation across both the local level and the supranational level?
Ideally, they would react the way the Taiwanese government reacted to the protesters. They would say, yeah, you're right, we're sorry for trying to pass this trade deal with China, which had triggered the revolts. And you know what, we're going to listen to you, and we're going to include your solution, and we're going to appoint some of you to help us fix the problem. That's the ideal solution. In practice, I'll tell you, that's not what's happening in most places. You mentioned the Yellow Vest movement, so that was the fuel tax was a technocratic gesture. That was a one-size-fits-all solution that triggered a social rebellion. So Macron, open-minded somewhat, said, okay, we're going to try a deliberative solution. He did a citizens' convention on climate that put forward, so 150 randomly selected citizens, that put forward 149 proposals, none of which included a carbon tax. So, they were very creative in not doing that. But then it went to Parliament, and what did Parliament do? Totally dilute the proposals, actually. So it was a little bit of a disappointment. And I've seen again and again, elected officials, not all. I'm just publishing a book called Politics Without Politicians, so I'm not a fan. but some of them are actually open to the criticism and ready to evolve. And so, but usually the reaction is, it's illegitimate competition for our work. We're elected, let us do our work.
Right.
And I think we need to rethink the concept of legitimacy, because I think, civil society, people selected at random, etc., they have a different kind of legitimacy, not rooted in election, but in equality, really. And so ideally, the system would just see the potential of losing power to these new forms of, decision-making in exchange for more legitimacy at the systems level. And some politicians see that and understand that. And I just wanted to announce, actually, for the first time publicly, that the Connecticut, there's something happening in Connecticut right now. We're designing a state-level citizens' assembly to discuss the possibility of reforming the property tax, involving citizens and AI-powered consultations as well. So I think some politicians are getting it. They can't solve it themselves, so they're asking for help.
Yes, I think there's been a lot of discussion of the poly crisis and the crisis during these 3 days, and really for the last couple of years. I do think that it's a cliche, but the reason cliches are cliches is because they're true. Cliches create opportunities, and I do think that as the legacy institutions falter, we're going to have opportunities to do exactly this sort of thing, and it creates spaces for creativity for all of you, particularly the young people, to do new things. So we have a couple of minutes left, and I want to say, if anybody has questions for these four panelists, I want to make that possible. Yes, I see somebody has a hand up here.
Hi, my name is Lucy, and I'm from the American University of Paris, and I'm wondering, how can citizens push their governments to move towards planetary governance? Because we talked a lot about what politicians and political actors must do, but what about on the citizen side?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear, but I think the question was, what can citizens do in this process, not just politicians?
Okay.
Maybe I want to put it to the two people who are politicians. What do you think citizens should do in order to most effectively engage you?
I mean, it sounds like such an obvious thing to say, and a great question, Lucy, thank you for your question, is you've got to start organizing and actually not waiting for politicians to make the difference, right? You've got to start to, if you look at some of the most, I mean, I think about some of the examples that have shifted me or my mayor or like just generally in society, some of the most like powerful things that we've been able to achieve in society is where people have organized and we've had to respond to their demands. And, there's always a danger that we all just wait around, like you were talking about the US, everyone in the US right now that I know that is not happy about the direction of travel, they're all just sitting waiting for who's next going to be, who's going to come in and who's going to come in and sort this mess out. Whereas actually what you've got to do is you've got to start thinking about how you can organize locally and build power locally and actually develop that. And there's a great example of that actually in New York City right now with Zohran Mamdani, who's been able to galvanize, thousands of young people, a real people-powered movement, which is a campaign that is really based on actually listening to people's ideas and actually talking about the things that people want to talk about. And so the point I'm trying to make is as someone who's a politician, my advice is don't wait around for politicians, like actually start organizing, getting out, what are the priorities, how do you make sure that you hold politicians to account and actually let them know that if they don't deliver, they may not be in that position again.
Well, let me try to give an answer in an indirect way. In our discussion this morning, we have heard several references to sovereignty. And that's interesting because sovereignty is something that stimulates thinking about the right of a nation. I'm a sovereign nation, therefore I have certain rights. And it's interesting that the discussion on sovereignty never really produced results about responsibility. What is the responsibility of sovereign nations? And how is the responsibility shared? And is there something like pooling of sovereignty, pooling of responsibility? This doesn't exist. And frankly, when one puts this in a relationship with democracy, democratic processes, you are likely to get more and more emphasis on the rights aspect of sovereignty rather than responsibility aspect, which of course is always there, but it is never popular in a political discourse. Now, what is the way out? One possibility is to put the right kind of agenda into the forefront, and that right kind of an agenda probably would have to include reforms at the international institutional level, because that is not in collision with the sovereignty as a right. No, we have a right, we propose changes, and it is not inimical to the sentiment of the people who would like to see change. So instead of trying to change ourselves, we always try to change the international system. That's quite natural, quite human, and politically realistic. So I think that the way forward is in the adequate reforms of the international system, which would correspond to responsibilities that our era has brought, responsibility that sovereignty entails, and something that can lead us to a better future. The systems of international cooperation have to change, and that includes all the mechanisms that we now know, and the debate, of course, which is ongoing, should be intensified.
Excellent. Well, let's give the panelists, we have time for one more question. All right, one more question here. Over here. Well, no.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, my name's Kim Cordova. I am a contributor with the New York Times. My question for you is around the role of corporations, specifically transnational digital tech companies, and in particular thinking about AI companies and what their role is. When we talk about this idea of planetary grounding and planetary thinking, it's very much about public goods, the commons. And so as these companies are creating technologies that are disproportionately utilizing resources, but then potentially also shifting the relationship between capital and labor, how can citizens be thinking about pushing back, especially from a political perspective?
I'm gonna suggest that Stewart and Hélène deal with that question.
Yeah, let me. It's a huge question. I think that, and obviously there are different models around the world about how one actually governs large tech platforms and what kind of accountability one holds them to. I mean, it's quite extraordinary in the United States, and not just with respect to AI, but with respect to satellites and space launchers. Some of the same companies, at least a couple of the same companies involved in this. And I think that there just needs to be greater controls on the influence peddling and corruption in terms of the ability of those companies to, in a sense, get their way and subvert any sort of public accountability. I think that for all its faults, one of the great things about the EU AI Act is that it actually tries to put the public interest first. And so I think one would have to go through and look at how things are being done in in India and other countries, but and obviously you probably want to try to get some middle ground between what's going on in the United States, where the government is increasingly bought and paid for by AI companies, and China, where everything is subservient to the state and citizens have very few rights with respect to that. But a more complicated issue than I think I can give it justice to.
Okay. Hélène, I'm going to let you have the last word because I know we all need to get off stage. So.
Okay, I'll just say this. I think it's the first time in history that we have a generation that sees itself as global, Gen Z, I've seen fascinating exchanges between activists in Nepal talking to activists in Serbia right now, which is also it's been in a uproar for a while. And they compare their political situation, and they see the common points, and they see the difference, and they strategize. And you see this network now with people in Morocco as well, building on this movement. So I think that's, for me, very inspiring, because there's global consciousness, and they are getting wiser and smarter, and hopefully they'll change things.
Great. Let's give the panelists a hand.
Thank you.